Andrew is an author and photographer from Skagway, Alaska. His first book is called Fish This, an Alaskan Story, and it's being published by Lynn Canal Publishing and is due for release in December. Christmas present. So please put your hands together for Andrew and let's hear his story.
Have you ever been in a situation where you knew it wasn't going to work out well? I've been in Alaska for 18 years. I come from Tampa, Florida, and thanks, Tampa people here, that's great. I used to go fishing when I was just barely old enough to remember with my Cuban grandmother, and we'd go out on the docks and she used a hand line, and that's how I learned to fish, and fishing was always a huge part of my life. Well, coming to Alaska, everything that I learned was completely wrong. So in a lot of ways, I'm just now turning into an adult fisherman in Alaska. But this was about 10 years ago. And if any of you have ever been to Skagway, you know there's two things about Skagway that pretty much everybody knows about. One, there's lots of tourists. And two, it's very windy. And it's always windy. In fact, if you get one day where there's no wind, you're doing good. If you get 2 days where there's no wind, that's phenomenal. 3 days with no wind is unheard of. 4 days without wind only happens once every 10 years. And this happened 10 years ago. Now, the first 3 days of that 4-day period, I was working, and I worked, of all places, in a restaurant that overlooked the small boat harbor, with the mountains in the background, Harding Mountain with the glaciers, the silt-laden waters that are full of fish. But there's also tourists. And they're pouring off the boat, sometimes 10,000 of them a day. And this still happens to this day, and it happened then. And this particular day was a Friday. And it was the only day of the week that I was getting off of work early, about 4 o'clock. And it was July, and it had been 80 degrees for 4 days. And it was beautiful. And I was like, if the wind just stays down this 4th day, I'll be able to get off work. I had my fishing pole in the car, of course. And I was going to grab my fishing rod and go down to the small boat harbor and fish for dollies. Normally what I would do, if I have a day off, is I go up into the Yukon Territory, travel the highway, get somewhere where I will never see another tourist. But if you live in Skagway, you know where the nooks and crannies are where you can get away from tourists. And one of those nooks and crannies was behind the restaurant, right at the mouth of the small boat harbor. So that's where I was going to go fish. And I'm watching it all day. I know the wind's going to come up. The wind's going to come up. For sure, the wind's going to come up. 4 o'clock rolls around, no wind. So even though I'd fielded questions all day from people in the restaurant, oh, what's the elevation here? Grabbed my fishing rod, went down to the mouth of the small boat harbor. Now, if you can imagine, you have to walk all the way around. It's about a half mile all the way around. You have to walk. And then you get to the mouth of the small boat harbor, and you're facing the ocean with the mountains in front of you, and it's perfect. The rod I had is perfect for catching dolly varden. It's a lightweight rod. It's 7 feet long, but very wispy. 6-pound line, a 1/0 MEP spinner on it. And if you know anything about a 1/0 MEP spinner, it's about this big. It's a little tiny thing. I always tie on leader. It's a habit. I tie on 30-pound leader. It's a habit I learned as a little kid with my grandmother, because if you hook a big fish, even if it doesn't have big teeth, they still wear through the line. So I had the leader tied on. And I'm out there, and I cast that first cast into this beautiful weather. I could feel a drip of sweat going down my spine. The line goes out, it lands in the water, the line falls in curled ringlets right on the water, and I'm in heaven. And I did this for about a half hour. I cast and I realized it didn't matter, I wasn't catching any fish. I'd had a beer before I left work, of course. So I was in good shape. And then I see something out of the corner of my eye. Now there's an otter down there, and he's been there for years. And this otter, he'll come up to you and he'll laugh at you and mock you because he'll have a fish in his hands, and he'll laugh at you and then swim away and eat it right over here next to you. So I was certain it was the otter. But when I look about from to the first row, about where you're sitting, it's a big king salmon, the biggest king salmon I've ever seen in Skagway. Normally a big fish there, 25, 30 pounds, that's a huge one. This fish was bigger. And it's cruising right along, and I have my rod up, and so instinctually, without thinking about it, I cast. The lure landed about 2 inches in front of the nose of that king salmon, and he gently reached up and took it. And I see this, I see it, he's right there. And so I set the hook, and I set it a bunch of times because this line is really light and the rod is very wispy. And I set the hook, And the fish starts doing this. It starts undulating. And the rod's doing this. It's doing this. I'm like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Well, I got to try and work the fish in. And the second I put pressure on the fish, he figured out that he was hooked, and he ran not out in the ocean, but straight into the small boat harbor at full speed. Now, just 50 feet away are the floats, the boats, the motors in the water, and this fish is heading straight for them. And I knew, well, I'm not going to catch it, but that was one hell of a cast. I get the rod and I shove it under the water so that maybe it gives me a little bit of an extra angle. The fish runs under the boats, it goes around, somehow it does not get snagged. Then it turns, and then it goes out to sea. And I'm certain, again, there's no possible way I'm going to get this fish in, because now it's going full speed out to sea. I've got about 180 yards of line, gets down to 160, maybe 20 yards of line left on the spool, and it turns again and it comes back. Well, this goes on for some time. It goes back in the harbor, back out to sea, back in the harbor, back out to sea. And about 45 minutes later, that fish is right here. How do I land it? If you know anything about fishing with light line, you know that the hardest thing to do is to land a fish. I didn't have a net. And even if I'd had a net for Dolly Varden, it would have done much good against a big king salmon. So I threw the rod down, put my hands underneath the gills. I could feel the gill rakers scraping my hands, and I pull that fish up out of the water. And as I pulled it up to here, its tail was still on the ground. And about 50 feet away on the floats is my friend Bob, and he's going to his boat. And I said, Bob, look at this. Bob goes, so then I had to carry the fish. I had to carry it all the way around the small boat harbor, about a half mile back to where I worked at the Skagway Fish Company as a bartender. And so I walked all the way around. And if you've ever carried a fish that probably weighed in the neighborhood of 40 to 45 pounds for 20 feet, that's a long way. But I had the adrenaline going, and about halfway there, the sweat's pouring, and halfway there, I'm really tired. I'm like, oh, maybe there's a way I could get the car and pull it around. But I had to carry it. Well, I get to where the fish company's at, and the tourists are everywhere. And the second the tourists see that fish, you would have thought Jesus had returned from the water, because everyone was out there with their cameras. They said, hold it up. I'm like, I am holding it up. Doing my best. But I have to admit, I didn't mind having my picture taken with that fish. I got one very fuzzy picture of that fish, and it had already been gutted, and it's not a great picture, but I'm sure there's lots of great pictures out there somewhere. Peoria, Tallahassee, Dallas, God only knows where. But I did learn one thing from catching that fish, and that one thing I learned is that even though you might feel like there's no hope in a situation and there's no way you can win, sometimes you're wrong.